This is a shelter in the time of storm. We welcome you to our program. My name is Roger Comstock. I preach for the Church of Christ in Morrison, Tennessee. We welcome you to our program today. As we've said in almost every program, the purpose of this program, the intent behind this program is to try to help people and encourage people as they go through the different traumatic events that happen in our lives. It's our desire to help you maintain your faith through these difficult times and look to God for a source of strength and comfort in the storms that come into our lives. We've been doing some programs on the subject of suicide. Suicide is a difficult subject to talk about. It's one of those subjects that pretty much no one wants to talk about, and quite honestly, I'd rather not also. But it really is something we need to talk about. We need to talk about and open some lines of communication. In this country of ours, just some statistical things, there are about every half hour, 2 people will take their life based on statistical data. 99 people per day in this country take their lives. That comes to nearly 36,000 for the year. Suicide ranks 10th as a cause of death in this nation of ours. It ranks 3rd among causes of death of young people. Just to give you an idea, in the causes of death in our nation, homicide ranks 15th. Only a few serious diseases cause more death in our country than suicide does. And so it is an important subject, something that we need to talk about. Not only do we need to talk about it to try to prevent these kinds of situations, but we also need to talk about it in order to be able to help those who are the survivors. That's an important word, survivor. There are, on average, 6 people that are directly affected by the suicide of an individual. Sometimes more, sometimes less, obviously. But on average, 6 people are directly affected by suicide. So let's talk about, for a few minutes, let's talk about some warning signs. And there are a lot of them, and if you want to write these down, that certainly I would encourage you to do so. But just some things that we can kind of watch for. Some of them will be obvious to you. Some of them you probably already know. One would be, obviously, a change in behavior, change in demeanor, change in, I don't want to say personality, but a change in how they react and interact with other people in the family and other people in the home. They may be depressed or have the appearance of being depressed, and in that they're sad a lot of the time. There may be a lot of talking about death and things related to death, maybe even talking about the subject of suicide. There may be sort of a withdrawing away from the family and not spending as much time with family and friends as would be normal. Sometimes the individual that may be contemplating suicide, there oftentimes is a sort of a feeling of helplessness, that they just don't know what to do, and they see no solution. They see no end to whatever misery that they are in at that particular time in their lives. There may be strong feelings of rage and anger within this person. They may be mad at a specific thing, a specific event, a specific situation. They may be mad at the world, but oftentimes there will be some anger displayed. Sometimes the potential suicide person may sort of feel trapped in a situation that they have no control over. It goes back to that helplessness. There may be some dramatic mood changes, may be caused by events in their life. It may be caused by drugs or alcohol. A lot of things can cause these drastic mood changes. And sometimes it's almost as if there's a change in their personality. They may do things impulsively, things that they wouldn't normally do on an impulse that they seem more likely to do. Sometimes they lose an interest in family activities, in being with the family, being around the family and friends as they might have done in the past. Sometimes there is a change in the sleeping habits and the eating habits of an individual, and how they, and part of the norm of life, and drastic changes in the norm of life. There may be, if they're a school student, college, or in the lower grades, there may be a change in the quality of their schoolwork. The grades may begin to drop, and maybe they're absent a lot, and so forth. Some people even begin to give away possessions that maybe were very dear to them, and they are contemplating suicide, so they give away things that were once important to them. Some even will write a will, not necessarily a suicide note. Some contend that it's not a real suicide unless there's a suicide note. Well, that's not true at all. We'll talk about that a little bit later, about some myths involving suicide. But another one of the possible warning signs would be the writing of a will. A writing of a will by a person who's perfectly healthy, but maybe some of these other changes have occurred in their lives, and they see the need to write a will. Sometimes there may be feelings of excessive guilt or shame. They've done something or committed some horrible act, or maybe caused some harm or something to another individual. And so they see as a relief from that, the only way out might be to take their own life. Sometimes sudden, we talked about impulsive behavior, but also reckless behavior, that they seem as though they don't care about life and whether they live or die. Some have said that of these signs that we've talked about, that about 75% of those who commit suicide will display one or several of these signs that we could certainly refer to as warning signs. But that leaves another 25% that never give any signs at all, any warning signs to their family members and close friends and so forth, people that are around them. And so, as we talked about in our previous program, the guilt that comes along with the grieving, sometimes we need to understand that there is nothing that you could do, no sign that you could have seen, no warning sign, nothing that you could have done. Keep in mind that we are all free moral agents. We've talked about that in other programs. That people make their own decisions, and so sometimes there is absolutely nothing we could do, even to the point of staying with them 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, which we can't do. We have to sleep and so forth. And so sometimes there's just nothing that could be done. Suicide is very devastating to a family. It is a single act, someone has said. It's a single act that has a plural effect, that it affects a lot of people. It affects a lot of different things within individuals. Sometimes literally hundreds of people are affected by the shock that comes with suicide and the grief that follows. That the extraordinariness of the event brings on this sudden shock and disbelief. Sometimes, as I said, with hundreds of people. When a suicide bomb, if I want to call it that, when that bomb is dropped, it is the family typically that is at ground zero, as we've come to refer to it from the 9/11 disaster. When the bomb of suicide drops, it's the family that is there at ground zero. One of the things that you as a family need to remember, you've survived. You are the survivor. You have survived, and you need to continue to survive. And that's an important part of understanding what's going on and dealing with what's going on. In previous programs, we've talked about the difference in a cave mentality, drawing in and closing in, versus a tunnel mentality, that there is a light at the end of the tunnel. We need to remember that there is a future, that you are a survivor. Suicide is sort of a triple whammy, if you will, to the family of survivors. One, obviously, you've lost someone who's very dear to you. That in itself, no matter what the cause would have been, whether a serious illness of some kind, an accident, a car wreck, or even when it's suicide, you have lost someone that's dear to you. And it's understandable that there's going to be grief connected. As we talked about in the previous program, the suddenness and the acute nature of a suicide magnifies the feelings of grief that are involved. The pain and shock of that sudden death is just sometimes just will practically knock us to our knees, sometimes literally knock us to our knees. And then thirdly, the suicide, the pain that is caused by a suicide, the stigma attached, the embarrassment, the humiliation that is involved for the survivors. I seriously doubt that one who contemplates taking their own life ever thinks about the effect that it's going to have on other people. And yet it can be very devastating effects. You see, there is a path for a permanent survival of a family. Our objective would be certainly to keep the family intact permanently, that this event in the life of a family not be the cause of destroying the family. You know, in life people play games. It's unfortunate, but you know, in reality, we all play games, so of one kind or another. And you know, really how we're attracted to certain individuals is if that person is willing to play the same kind of game that we want to play. And so even at the time of a death in a family, and particularly in a suicide situation, many times the people want to play games. And we're going to talk about some different games that people will play. But one of the things we need to be aware of or be honest about, that these games that people play, we've learned those in our childhood. We've watched the adults around us and we've seen how they play the games, and then we sort of act out those same behaviors in our own lives. Most relationships, as I said, are based on who will play this particular game with me. Suicide never happens in a vacuum. There are people connected in all different directions, and so there are fingers going out, fingers of effect, you might say, going out, roots going out in all different directions that are affected by a suicide. Sadly, most of the games people play, most of them are destructive. They're destructive to the sanctity, if you will, of a family. You know, God names three specific institutions, if you will, in the Bible. Three institutions that are very sacred to Him. Two of them overlap, the family and marriage. Those two institutions are premier in God's eyes, and certainly the church. The church is so important that God would compare marriage to the church. That tells us what He thinks of marriage as well. Sadly, as I said, these games are destructive to most families. One of the games people play we would call scapegoating. We want to find somebody to blame. And you know, they used to tell us when we were kids that if you're pointing the finger at someone, if you look, there are three pointing back at you. Sometimes when we play the scapegoating game, it is because we want the attention to fall on someone else and therefore taking the attention off of me. And so we play the scapegoating game. Whatever the cost, we're going to blame somebody for this tragedy in our lives, in our family. And so the finger pointing begins. She drove him to it. He should have seen the signs. We want to blame someone. And many times, those who want to play this kind of game, as I said, seek to relieve their own guilt. Sadly, no one wins. In these games that are played in scapegoating, no one wins. It's not beneficial. It's not helpful to the health of the family. Another game that is played sometimes by family members is like the old game show we used to watch called I've Got a Secret. That's what the game some people want to play, and they think they can escape the stigma and the embarrassment, the humiliation of suicide by a family member by, let's just keep it a secret. And sometimes people will go to extraordinary lengths to bring that about, and they'll hide evidence. They may sometimes they'll destroy a suicide note if there is one. They may find it, then they destroy it, thinking that way no one can prove that this is a suicide. It can be treated as if it were an accident. And they'll try to manipulate doctors and coroners and policemen and the news media because they're embarrassed about the stigma that comes with suicide, unfortunately comes with suicide. Some will even, as I said, they'll even go to the point of destroying evidence so that they can keep this secret. There is the game that I would call the myth, or the myth of denial, or the denial myth, I guess is a better way to say it. Somewhat closely related to the I've got a secret game, but this is different in that the person is actually denying that this horrible thing has happened to their family, this really didn't happen. It had to have been an accident. He really wouldn't have done that. He would never have, and you know, we need to be careful when we make never statements. I would never do that, or he would never have done that. Be careful of those never statements, because those never statements sometimes can come back to haunt us. The denial myth, it just can't be, can't happen. Even in the face of solid evidence, sometimes people will play that denial game. There is the game called Circle the Wagons. And you know the old cowboy movies and how the wagon train going west, and at night or when they're in danger or under attack or whatever, they would circle the wagons for their protection, for the protection of the entire group. It's similar to I've Got a Secret and the denial game, in that by circling the wagons, we think we can keep it all closed in, that no one else will find out about it. It's kind of an us against the world mentality, that if we don't let this out, then it really didn't happen. If no one knows about it and we just keep this in our family, then the world won't know about it. The stigma won't be there, and it really didn't happen. Sometimes families feel threatened. They feel threatened by the rejection from society. They feel threatened because of the stigma that we've talked about, the stigma that's attached to when a suicide occurs. And it is real. The stigma and the rejection is real. And people don't know how to react to family, the grievers, the survivors in a suicide situation. Sometimes in the Circle the Wagon games, we want to kind of fence off the family, cut off any communication with outsiders about this particular event, and therefore we keep it within our family, and this is our little secret, and usually secrets aren't so secret, are they? And what this does, it rejects the even honest investigation, stifles honest investigation, and stifles the grieving process. The grieving will still be there, but it'll be somewhat retarded, somewhat slow in being able to work through the healing process. Another game that people play, I would call, like the kids' game, King on the Mountain. This particular family member is now gone, and who's going to take his place? And sometimes there are those who are vying for that top spot in the leadership of the family. It's sort of a power struggle within the family. And again, it's very destructive to a family. But this person who has always wanted to be in charge, now they think they can be in charge. And so this game of King of the Hill is sometimes played, and it's really is based in selfishness. It's based in self-interest. What's in it for me, and what can this do for me, and how is this going to affect me? It's all about me in the King of the Hill game. And sadly, it usually creates a great deal of antagonism among other family members. And then there is the game we'll call the silent treatment. In the game called the silent treatment, in that game, the family just doesn't talk. They don't communicate and don't talk about the situation, about what has happened and the unspeakable thing that's happened in their family. And they literally mean it's unspeakable. And there are sometimes families who say, we will not talk about this. Obviously, when communication is stifled, then also the grieving process is stifled as well. And each one kind of goes off into their own little corner and grieves by themselves and lose the support that is so desperately needed at a very difficult time, losing the support of other family members. Possibly, this may be the most devastating game of all in the way that it stifles the healing. In the silent treatment, there are certainly some negative effects. As we said, it prevents healthy grieving. And just very briefly, we need to recognize that grieving is a healthy process. It's the way God made us. It's the way He intended us to do. And it is this collection of emotions that come into play when we have a significant loss in our lives. And so when we play the silent game, the silent treatment, then the healing is quite stifled. The grieving process is limited. There are the loss of comparing, sharing emotions, supporting one another. And supporting one another means there's sometimes that I lean on the other family members. Sometimes those family members can lean on me. And there has to be that sharing for it to be a healthy situation. And sometimes in the silent, an effect of the silent treatment is that bad information, misinformation will flourish. You know as well as I do how the rumors fly. That's always the case. And when the rumors fly, someone needs to correct it. And I've been in situations as a preacher in trying to minister to families where I've known facts about the situation that I've needed to share with the family because they're hearing rumors about this and that and horrible things that have now gotten back to the family. And so there needs to be that communication so truth and fact can be shared. I absolutely believe that knowledge is power. Knowledge dispels fear. And so the truth needs to come out. There is the game, who loved who most? Oh, I loved him more than you did, so I'm hurting more than you are. And many times family members will even argue about who loved the deceased more. And some see that as a ticket to the leadership role, that I was the closest to them, so then you all ought to listen to me and so forth. Sometimes this idea sort of softens the guilt from a lack of love, from if the person who is deceased, and maybe you have this feeling that you didn't love them like you should have, and so forth. There sometimes can be some guilt involved in that as well. Sometimes revenge is a motive for suicide. Sometimes the person who has committed suicide has done that just to get back at the people who love them the most. Hard to understand sometimes, but keep in mind that every suicide situation is different and all are difficult to understand. Sometimes the very reverse is true and is played out, and the deceased, if the deceased was a difficult person, if the deceased was a person that was hard to be around, that person maybe in their behaviors and their personality and so forth, in and of themselves, they were sort of destructive to the family. And sometimes there can be some relief involved, relief that destructive force is no longer there. And then, as we've mentioned in previous programs, then sometimes there's guilt involved in that as well. Another one of the games that comes into play is what sometimes maybe we could call Let's Grieve Forever. This is the kind of game that people play where they wear their grief like a badge, like I'm the county sheriff, and they wear their grief on their shirt sleeve, as we might say, and it's very visible and out there for everybody to see, and it brings them attention and so forth, and oh, woe is me, and oh, let's sympathize with it, and sometimes people want this to go on forever because they enjoy the attention that comes at the time of their loss. Less devotion or less less love and a lack of love, sometimes we try to find some way to compensate for that and try to make up for that. Sometimes the wife will swear to her family members maybe that she'll swear that she'll never marry again. And another person maybe makes a commitment that I'm going to visit the grave of our loved one. I'm going to go every single day. And there's nothing wrong with that. And there's nothing wrong with a widow not wanting to remarry. Nothing wrong with that. But when it becomes something that we do to attract attention, then it can become a problem and can become destructive. We need to be careful that we don't erect shrines out of our grief and to almost iconize, make an icon out of the deceased and what has taken place in your family. There is the halo and the pitchfork game, that one person wants to talk about all the bad that the deceased has done, and another person wants to talk about all the good that they've done. One wants to talk about the positive and ignore the suicide. The other one wants to upplay the negative to emphasize and how destructive this person has been and how damaging that can be and how difficult that can be to work through. There's another game, the last one that we'll talk about as we close today. There's another game that I would call Head for the Hills. You just can't deal with the stigma and the trauma involved in the suicide, so we're just going to leave. We'll sell our house, we'll move to another community, and maybe the suicide occurred within the home. And that does make for a very, very difficult situation. Maybe children are having nightmares. Be careful about making drastic moves, literally moves from location to location. Be careful about making any big decisions for, I tell people, a year at least. Don't make any big decisions, because when we play the game Head for the Hills, rarely does it come out good. Sometimes we just trade one set of problems for another set of problems. Sometimes we just want to escape the community's knowledge, and we think if we go to a new community, a new town, that no one will know. As I said, sometimes we trade problems for problems. I would encourage you to keep your family together. Make that the objective in this very difficult time. May God bless you through these difficult things.